Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving headfirst into what is honestly one of the most chilling theological mysteries of the 20th century. We're talking about the prophetic warnings given in Akita, Japan. And get this, these were actually approved by the Vatican. We're going to impartially break down the deep theology, the history, and the really profound implications behind what's known as the third message of Akita. So whether you're, deeply familiar with Catholic end times theology, or you're just absolutely fascinated by historical prophecies, this breakdown is going to give you a really clear, structured look at exactly what this message entails. So whether you're, deeply familiar with Catholic end times theology, or you're just absolutely fascinated by historical prophecies, this breakdown is going to give you a really clear, structured look at exactly what this message entails. Listen to this terrifying excerpt straight from the 1973 third message. If men do not repent and better themselves, the Father will inflict a terrible punishment on all humanity. Fire will fall from the sky. I mean, wow, talk about an intense warning, right? This isn't just some vague prediction. It's a highly specific theological warning. And we aren't just going to look at that literal threat of physical fire, but actually the much deeper internal crisis that this message predicts. So, let's start with part one, the Akita phenomenon, a rare, Vatican-approved revelation. It's actually incredibly rare for the Vatican to give the official green light to a private revelation, but the events of 1973 did exactly that. In a convent right on the outskirts of Akita, Japan, a novice nun named Sister Agnes Sasagawa began receiving these messages through a wooden statue of the Virgin Mary. And one of the most striking physical signs of this whole phenomenon is the number 101. The wooden statue didn't just speak. It wept actual tears, and this happened exactly 101 times. Now, according to the apparition's guardian angel, that number 101, absolutely not random. Think of it like a theological puzzle. The first one represents Eve, who brought sin into the world. The final one represents Mary, who brought the grace of salvation. And that zero right in the middle, that represents the eternal, unending presence of God, bridging the two together. It's a remarkably perfect, concise summary of the faith. Okay, let's map out exactly how these messages escalated throughout 1973. Things started off on July 6th with physical signs, a bleeding hand on the statue, and a direct call for personal prayer. By August 3rd, the focus widened to the convent's overall mission, specifically asking for reparation and sacrifice for the sins of humanity. And then we hit October 13th. The scope just explodes into a global eschatological event, this massive warning of a great chastisement. As you trace it, it moves very clearly from the personal to the communal, right up to the global end times. Now here is where it gets really fascinating. That specific date, October 13th, huge deal. On October 13th, 1917, tens of thousands of people witnessed the famous Miracle of the Sun in Fatima, Portugal. Well, exactly 56 years later, to the very day, the third message was delivered on October 13th, 1973, in Akita. Theological experts will tell you for sure that is absolutely no coincidence. The Akita message is widely analyzed as a direct continuation, or kind of like a final underlining, of those profound warnings originally given at Fatima. Moving on to part two, the spiritual collapse and the true meaning of compromise. So we just talked about the literal threat of fire from the sky, but the core of the Akita prophecy actually shifts to a severe warning about an internal, spiritual collapse happening right within the Catholic Church itself. And that danger is framed around one single word: compromise. In Catholic theology, compromise represents a spiritual defection. Delivered shortly after the massive sweeping changes of the Second Vatican Council, this prophecy warns of an era where divine truths, core doctrines, and strict moral codes are essentially watered down to fit secular modern values. It's a warning about losing the sense of sin, avoiding talk of judgment, and just bending completely to modernism. This compromise is the internal decay of the faith. So how does this compromise actually look in practice? Well, the apparition gave a very specific instruction to Sister Agnes. The sisters there had a daily prayer, but the apparition asked them to add one specific word to it: truly. Most Sacred Heart of Jesus, truly present in the Holy Eucharist. This wasn't just a minor edit. It was meant to combat the growing theological compromise that was starting to treat the Eucharist as just a symbol or a nice community meal, rather than the literal presence of Christ. The addition of that single word was a direct counterattack against diluting core doctrine. Which brings us to part three, the fall of the shepherds. We're talking schism and clergy defection. The message explicitly warns that the devil isn't just going after everyday believers. No, the strategy is to strike the shepherds so the flock will scatter. Listen to this startling prophecy. Cardinals will oppose cardinals. Bishops will oppose bishops. The church will be full of those who accept compromises. It is predicting a literal internal church schism. It even goes on to say that faithful priests who stick to traditional teachings will be despised and persecuted by their own colleagues. It's a stark, frankly devastating vision of a theological civil war within the church, where holding the traditional line literally makes you an outcast among your own peers. To put this into perspective, let's ground this 1973 prophecy in some statistical reality. If we look at the Catholic Church in Japan over a recent 20-year period, we see a dramatic 34.8% decline in the total number of clergy, religious workers, and seminarians. It dropped from its previous total all the way down to just 65.2%. Whether it's through aging out or just walking away from their vows entirely, that prophecy of empty altars and a shrinking priesthood is visibly, measurably unfolding in the data. All right, part 4, the survivors and the eschatological remnant. So, if the church hierarchy is fracturing and fire is falling from the sky, who is actually left? The prophecy speaks of survivors who are going to suffer greatly. To really decode this, we need to view it through the theological lens of the end times, also known as eschatology. Survivors in this context doesn't just mean people who make it through a physical disaster. The remnant is a small, faithful group of believers who maintain the Orthodox faith and tradition during times of intense persecution or mass apostasy. Basically, when the altars are stripped and the broader church compromises, this faithful remnant essentially becomes an underground church, holding tightly to the original truth even when the vast majority has just walked away. And this idea of a remnant didn't just pop up out of nowhere. It traces all the way back through the Bible. In the Old Testament, during times of mass idolatry and state collapse, it was the 7,000 hidden believers who refused to worship Baal. In the New Testament, Paul identifies the remnant as those chosen by faith rather than just a bloodline. And in the book of Revelation, during the final tribulation, it's that small group keeping God's commandments against all odds. Akita's survivors are essentially the modern-day continuation of this exact theological lineage. Let's dive into part 5, the arsenal, the 2 remaining weapons. Okay, I know this all sounds pretty bleak, but the third message of Akita does not leave humanity defenseless, not at all. The prophecy outlines 2 specific spiritual defenses to help mitigate the damage. First, the rosary, which serves as a weapon of daily intercession to protect the targeted pope, bishops, and priests from the devil's influence. Second is the sign of the sun, which theologians, and actually the visionary herself, interpret as the Holy Eucharist. As the external church crumbles around them, unwavering belief in the true, literal presence of Christ in the Eucharist becomes the ultimate anchor. These are the 2 survival tools left for the faithful. So, what does this all mean for the everyday believer? The Akita message summarizes into 3 really practical requests for anyone who wishes to be part of that faithful remnant. First, endure your daily hardships as a sacrifice to make up for the world's sins. Second, hold the line. Defend the true, literal presence of the Eucharist against modern dilution. And third, pray the rosary every single day and aim those prayers directly at the clergy who are under spiritual attack. It's a strict, very demanding call to action. And that brings us to our final and honestly most crucial point. The entire third message of Akita rests on a massive if. It is a conditional warning. If men do not repent. The source material strongly emphasizes that this is not some deterministic, locked-in doom. It's a motherly warning meant to actually change human behavior. So the ultimate question left hanging over this explainer, and really over the world according to this theology, is this. Will humanity heed the warning and change course? Or is the prophesied chastisement inevitable? Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive. Keep questioning and keep learning.